In the labyrinthine corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows dance with secrets and power whispers its eternal promises, there exists a truth so profound that it is echoed through centuries of human ambition. Niccolo Machiavelli, that master architect of political reality, understood something that most men spend their entire lives failing to grasp. The greatest enemy you will ever face is not the one who stands before you with sword drawn, but the one who stares back at you from the mirror each morning. The concept of winning without support seems, at first glance, to be a contradiction in terms. How does one triumph in a world built on alliances, networks, and the complex web of human relationships? Yet Machiavelli's writings reveal a startling proposition that cuts through this apparent impossibility, like a blade through silk. The answer lies not in seeking external validation or building extensive support systems, but in the radical transformation of the self, specifically, in the deliberate destruction of one's weaker nature. This is not merely philosophical abstraction. In the blood-soaked chronicles of Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell like wheat before the scythe, Machiavelli observed princes who commanded vast armies yet fell to their own indecision, and others who, standing alone, carved empires from nothing but will and strategic brilliance. The difference, he noted, lay not in their circumstances but in their relationship with their own nature. The weak self, that collection of fears, hesitations, moral squeamishness, and emotional attachments that bind most men to mediocrity, is not merely an obstacle to success. It is the primary mechanism by which others can manipulate, control, and ultimately destroy us. When we cling to the comfortable illusions of our limitations, when we allow sentiment to override strategy, when we mistake kindness for virtue and brutality for evil without context, we hand our enemies the very weapons they will use against us. Consider the trajectory of those who have achieved lasting power throughout history. They share a common characteristic that transcends their particular circumstances. At some crucial moment, they chose to sacrifice their weaker impulses on the altar of necessity. This is not about becoming cruel or heartless. Such simplistic interpretations miss Machiavelli's sophisticated understanding of human nature. Rather, it is about developing the capacity to act independently of emotional comfort, social approval, or moral certainty. The modern world, with its emphasis on collaboration and consensus building, has obscured this fundamental truth. We are taught to seek support, to build networks, to rely on others for validation and assistance. These are not inherently wrong approaches, but they become fatal weaknesses when they represent our only strategy for advancement. The person who cannot win alone will inevitably find themselves at the mercy of those who can, withdraw their support at the most crucial moments. Machiavelli's genius lay in his recognition that true strength comes from self-sufficiency. Not the crude self-sufficiency of the hermit or the sociopath, but the refined self-sufficiency of one who understands both their own nature and the nature of others so thoroughly that they can navigate any situation regardless of external circumstances. This requires a kind of psychological surgery, the careful removal of those aspects of our personality that make us dependent on others for our sense of identity, purpose, or security. The process begins with a ruthless inventory of our weaknesses. Most people avoid this exercise because it is profoundly uncomfortable. We prefer to focus on our strengths, our positive qualities, our noble intentions. But Machiavelli understood that our strengths are rarely what defeat us. It is our unexamined weaknesses that provide the openings through which our enemies strike. The leader who falls does not fall because they lacked vision or intelligence. They fall because they could not control their pride, their fear, their need for approval, or their attachment to outdated ways of thinking. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli witnessed countless examples of this principle in action. Princes who possessed every advantage, wealth, armies, noble bloodlines, popular support, would crumble at the first serious challenge, because they had never learned to operate independently of these advantages. When their circumstances changed, when their supporters abandoned them, when their wealth was threatened, they discovered that they had built their entire identity on external factors beyond their ultimate control. Conversely, those who had learned to destroy their weak selves possessed a kind of invulnerability that went beyond mere military or political power. They had internalized the capacity to create value, to generate solutions, to inspire loyalty, and to adapt to changing circumstances regardless of their starting position. This internal strength made them dangerous opponents and valuable allies, but more importantly, it made them independent actors in a world of dependent followers. The destruction of the weak self is not a single dramatic moment, but a continuous process of refinement and strengthening. It requires the development of what Machiavelli called virtue, a concept that encompasses not just traditional virtue, but also skill, adaptability, courage, and the wisdom to know when conventional morality must be suspended in service of larger goals. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Machiavellian thinking. He was not advocating for immorality, but for a more sophisticated understanding of when and how moral principles should be applied. The weak self is fundamentally reactive. It responds to circumstances rather than creating them. It seeks security through conformity, rather than through competence. It measures success by external validation rather than by objective results. When we operate from this weak position, we become predictable, controllable, and ultimately disposable. Others can manipulate our emotions, exploit our fears, and use our dependencies against us. The transformed self, having destroyed these weaknesses, operates from a position of proactive strength. It creates circumstances rather than merely responding to them. It finds security through competence and adaptability, rather than through the goodwill of others. It measures success by results rather than by approval. This transformation makes one both unpredictable to enemies and invaluable to allies, creating a kind of practical invulnerability that no external force can easily breach. This is why Machiavelli insisted that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. It is not because such a person becomes physically invulnerable or immune to misfortune, but because they have eliminated the internal mechanisms through which external forces typically achieve destruction. They cannot be manipulated through fear because they have mastered their fears. They cannot be controlled through shame because they have moved beyond the need for universal approval. They cannot be paralyzed by uncertainty because they have developed the capacity to act effectively even with incomplete information. The path to this transformation requires a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the world. Instead of seeing ourselves as victims of circumstances, we must learn to see ourselves as the primary authors of our destiny. Instead of seeking comfort in the familiar patterns of thought and behavior that have defined us, we must actively seek out challenges that force us to grow beyond our current limitations. Instead of measuring our worth by how others perceive us, we must develop internal standards based on competence and results. This process is necessarily solitary. While we may receive guidance, support, and encouragement from others, the fundamental work of self-transformation cannot be delegated or shared. It requires honest self-examination, uncomfortable choices, and the willingness to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term strength. It demands that we confront the aspects of ourselves that we would prefer to ignore and that we take responsibility for outcomes that we would prefer to blame on others. The Renaissance provides numerous examples of individuals who successfully completed this transformation. Cesare Borgia, despite his ultimate defeat, demonstrated how someone could rise from relatively modest circumstances to control vast territories through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Lorenzo de' Medici showed how political power could be maintained and expanded through a combination of cultural sophistication and ruthless pragmatism. Even Machiavelli himself, though never achieving the worldly success he desired, demonstrated how intellectual independence could create influence that outlasted any contemporary political arrangement. These figures shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from their peers. They possessed an unusual degree of self-awareness, understanding both their strengths and their limitations with remarkable clarity. They demonstrated flexibility in their methods while maintaining consistency in their goals. They showed the ability to form and dissolve alliances based on strategic considerations rather than personal preferences. Most importantly, they had developed the capacity to act decisively even in situations where the optimal choice was unclear. Modern examples of this principle can be found in entrepreneurs who build successful businesses despite lacking traditional credentials or connections, in artists who create influential works despite operating outside established cultural institutions, and in leaders who effect significant changes despite facing overwhelming opposition. What these individuals share is not any particular talent or advantage, but rather the capacity to operate independently of external validation or support. The weak self seeks consensus before acting, approval before creating, and guarantees before risking. The transformed self recognizes that consensus often represents the lowest common denominator of human ambition, that approval is frequently the reward for mediocrity, and that guarantees are illusions that prevent us from seizing genuine opportunities. By destroying these dependencies, we free ourselves to pursue excellence, regardless of whether others understand, approve, or support our efforts. This independence does not mean isolation or indifference to others. Indeed, those who have successfully destroyed their weak selves often become more effective at building genuine relationships and creating lasting value for others. The difference is that their relationships are chosen rather than compulsive, their contributions are strategic rather than reactive, and their commitments are made from strength rather than from neediness. The practical implications of this transformation extend into every area of life. In professional settings, it means developing skills and creating value that do not depend on the goodwill of any particular person or organization. In personal relationships, it means engaging with others from a position of choice rather than desperation. In intellectual pursuits, it means following truth and excellence rather than fashion or approval. In creative endeavors, it means expressing authentic vision rather than pandering to market expectations. Each of these applications requires the same fundamental shift, from external dependency to internal authority. This is not about becoming arrogant or dismissive of others' perspectives, but about developing the confidence and competence to make our own judgments and live with the consequences of our choices. It is about recognizing that while we cannot control others' responses to our actions, we can control our responses to their responses. The transformation process typically involves several distinct phases. The first is recognition, the honest acknowledgement that our current approaches are not producing the results we desire, and that fundamental change is necessary. This recognition often comes through failure, disappointment, or the painful realization that we have been living according to others' expectations rather than our own authentic goals. The second phase is deconstruction, the systematic identification and dismantling of the beliefs, habits, and relationships that have kept us in a state of dependency. This is often the most difficult phase because it requires us to abandon familiar comforts and face the uncertainty of not knowing who we will become. It may involve ending relationships that have become crutches, leaving situations that provide security but prevent growth, or challenging beliefs that have provided comfort but limited our potential. The third phase is reconstruction, the deliberate development of new capabilities, perspectives, and relationships that serve our authentic goals rather than our fears. This phase requires patience and persistence because genuine transformation takes time to solidify. It also requires the courage to experiment with new approaches and to learn from both successes and failures without becoming attached to either. The final phase is integration, the point at which the new patterns of thought and behavior become natural and automatic. At this stage, the person no longer needs to consciously choose strength over weakness, because strength has become their default mode of operation. They have internalized the capacity to create value, solve problems, and navigate challenges regardless of external circumstances. Throughout this process, Machiavelli's insights provide both guidance and encouragement. His analysis of successful leaders demonstrates that extraordinary achievement is possible for those willing to undergo this transformation, while his examination of failed leaders shows the inevitable consequences of remaining dependent on external factors. His work suggests that the capacity for this transformation exists within every person, but that most people lack either the understanding or the courage to pursue it. The modern world presents both unique opportunities and unique challenges for those seeking to apply these principles. On one hand, technology and global connectivity have created unprecedented opportunities for individuals to create value and build influence without traditional institutional support. Entrepreneurs can reach global markets, artists can find audiences, and thinkers can share ideas without relying on gatekeepers or intermediaries. On the other hand, the same technological forces have created new forms of dependency and new mechanisms for external control. Social media platforms manipulate behavior through carefully designed feedback loops. Consumer culture encourages dependency on external products and services for identity and satisfaction. Political and educational institutions often discourage independent thinking in favor of compliance and conformity. These modern challenges make Machiavelli's insights more relevant rather than less. The fundamental human dynamics he identified, the tendency toward dependency, the power of fear and desire to control behavior, the importance of strategic thinking over emotional reaction, remain constant across different technological and cultural contexts. The specific techniques for applying his principles may need to be adapted to contemporary circumstances, but the underlying logic remains sound. The economic implications of this transformation are particularly significant in an era of rapid change and uncertainty. Traditional career paths that promised security in exchange for loyalty have largely disappeared. replaced by a more fluid and competitive environment where individuals must continuously adapt and create value. Those who have destroyed their weak selves are better positioned to thrive in this environment because they have developed the internal resources necessary to navigate uncertainty and create opportunities. Similarly, the social implications extend beyond individual success to encompass broader questions of leadership and cultural change. Societies benefit when they contain individuals who can think and act independently, who can challenge conventional wisdom, and who can create solutions to emerging problems. The process of destroying the weak self, while primarily focused on personal transformation, ultimately serves larger social purposes by developing the kind of people capable of genuine leadership and innovation. The psychological aspects of this transformation deserve particular attention because they often present the greatest obstacles to success. The weak self is not merely a collection of bad habits or limiting beliefs. It represents our entire history of adapting to circumstances beyond our control. From early childhood, we learn to modify our behavior to gain approval, avoid punishment, and fit into social structures. These adaptations serve important purposes during our development, but they can become prisons if we never learn to transcend them. Breaking free from these psychological patterns requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands emotional courage, the willingness to experience discomfort, and the persistence to continue despite temporary setbacks. It also requires a sophisticated understanding of our own motivations and the ability to distinguish between genuine growth and mere reaction against our past limitations. The spiritual dimensions of this transformation, while not explicitly addressed in Machiavelli's political writings, are nonetheless implicit in his broader philosophy. The destruction of the weak self is essentially a form of ego death, the dissolution of the limited identity we have constructed based on our fears, desires, and social conditioning. What emerges from this process is not the absence of self, but rather a more authentic and powerful version of who we are capable of becoming. This spiritual aspect helps explain why the transformation is so difficult and why so few people complete it successfully. It requires us to let go of our attachment to being right, to being liked, to being safe, and to being in control. These attachments feel essential to our survival and happiness, but they actually limit our capacity for genuine achievement and fulfillment. Only by releasing them can we discover what lies beyond them. The strategic applications of these principles extend far beyond individual development to encompass organizational leadership, competitive strategy, and even military tactics. Organizations led by individuals who have completed this transformation tend to be more adaptable, more innovative, and more resilient than those led by people still operating from weakness and dependency. They can respond to changing market conditions more quickly because they are not paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes or the need to maintain consensus. In competitive situations, whether in business, politics, or other arenas, those who have destroyed their weak selves possess significant advantages. They can make decisions based on strategic considerations rather than emotional comfort. They can adapt their tactics to changing circumstances rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined plans. They can form and dissolve alliances based on mutual benefit rather than personal loyalty or animosity. Military history provides numerous examples of leaders who achieved victory against overwhelming odds through the application of these principles. They possessed the psychological strength to make difficult decisions under pressure, the strategic flexibility to adapt to unexpected developments, and the personal authority to inspire others to extraordinary efforts. Their victories came not from superior resources or favorable circumstances, but from their ability to operate independently of the limitations that constrained their opponents. The educational implications of this understanding are profound but largely ignored by contemporary institutions. Traditional education focuses on teaching students to succeed within existing systems rather than teaching them to think and act independently. Students learn to give teachers the answers they want to hear rather than to discover truth for themselves. They learn to compete for scarce resources, grades, admission to prestigious schools, approval, rather than to create value that benefits everyone. An educational approach based on Machiavellian principles would focus on developing students' capacity for independent judgment, strategic thinking, and creative problem-solving. It would encourage them to question conventional wisdom, to experiment with different approaches, and to take responsibility for their own learning and development. It would prepare them not just to find their place in existing structures, but to create new structures that better serve their authentic goals. The relationship between individual transformation and social change is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, societies shape individuals through their institutions, culture, and expectations. People who attempt to transform themselves in isolation may find their efforts frustrated by social pressures and systemic constraints. On the other hand, social change ultimately depends on individuals who have developed the capacity to think and act beyond the limitations of their cultural conditioning. This creates a dynamic tension that successful transformers must learn to navigate. They must be realistic about social constraints while refusing to be limited by them. They must understand cultural norms while maintaining the freedom to transcend them when necessary. They must work within existing systems while retaining the ability to create new systems when existing ones prove inadequate. The economic dimensions of this transformation become increasingly relevant as traditional employment relationships continue to evolve. The old model of exchanging loyalty and compliance for security and advancement is being replaced by more fluid arrangements where individuals must continuously demonstrate their value and adapt to changing requirements. Those who have destroyed their weak selves are better positioned to succeed in this new environment because they have developed the internal resources necessary to thrive, regardless of external circumstances. This shift has implications not just for individual careers but for entire economic systems. Economies benefit when they contain large numbers of people who can think independently, create value, and adapt to change. The process of destroying the weak self, while focused on personal development, ultimately serves broader economic purposes by developing the kind of human capital necessary for innovation and growth. The technological revolution adds another layer of complexity to these dynamics. Digital technologies have created new opportunities for individuals to create and distribute value without traditional intermediaries. At the same time, these same technologies have created new forms of dependency and control. Social media platforms can manipulate behavior through carefully designed feedback mechanisms. Algorithmic systems can limit our exposure to information and ideas that challenge our existing beliefs. Those who have destroyed their weak selves are better equipped to navigate these technological challenges because they have developed the psychological independence necessary to resist manipulation and the strategic thinking necessary to use technology as a tool rather than being used by it. They can harness the power of digital platforms without becoming dependent on them for their sense of identity or worth. The global nature of modern society also creates new opportunities and challenges for applying these principles. On one hand, global connectivity provides access to resources, markets, and collaborators that previous generations could never have imagined. On the other hand, global competition means that individuals must compete not just with their local peers, but with talented people from around the world. This global context makes the development of genuine competence and strategic thinking more important than ever. Those who rely on local advantages, protected markets, or cultural preferences may find themselves displaced by others who have developed more fundamental capabilities. The process of destroying the weak self becomes not just a path to personal success, but a necessity for remaining relevant in an increasingly competitive world. The cultural implications extend beyond individual success to encompass questions of leadership, innovation, and social progress. Cultures that encourage the development of independent strategic thinkers tend to be more dynamic and successful than those that prioritize conformity and compliance. The process of destroying the weak self, while challenging for individuals, ultimately benefits society by producing people capable of genuine leadership and creative problem-solving. This creates a responsibility for those who have completed or are undergoing this transformation to contribute to the development of others. Not everyone will choose to pursue this path, and not everyone who chooses it will succeed. But society benefits when the option is available and when successful examples provide guidance and inspiration for others. The artistic and creative applications of these principles deserve special attention because they illustrate how the destruction of the weak self can lead to authentic expression rather than mere calculation. Artists who have freed themselves from the need for approval or commercial success are often able to create works of lasting significance because they are guided by their genuine vision, rather than by market considerations or critical fashion. This does not mean that such artists ignore their audience or reject all external feedback, but rather that they have developed the internal authority to make their own judgments about their work. They can incorporate useful criticism while rejecting criticism that stems from others' limitations or biases. They can engage with commercial realities while maintaining their artistic integrity. The scientific and intellectual applications are equally significant. Researchers and thinkers who have destroyed their weak selves are better able to pursue truth regardless of whether their findings conform to established theories or popular beliefs. They can challenge conventional wisdom without being paralyzed by the fear of professional or social consequences. They can collaborate with others while maintaining their intellectual independence. This intellectual independence is particularly important in fields where established interests may resist new ideas, or where political and ideological considerations influence research priorities. Those who have completed the transformation can navigate these pressures while maintaining their commitment to truth and excellence. The transformation process itself provides valuable lessons about human nature and the conditions necessary for genuine change. Most people resist change even when their current situation is unsatisfactory, because change involves uncertainty and discomfort. The weak self prefers familiar problems to unfamiliar solutions. It would rather remain limited but predictable than risk the unknown territory of expanded capability. Overcoming this resistance requires more than willpower or positive thinking. It requires a systematic approach that addresses both the psychological and practical obstacles to transformation. This typically involves developing new skills and capabilities while simultaneously releasing old patterns of thought and behavior. It requires both construction and destruction, both addition and subtraction. The timing of this process is also crucial. Most people attempt to change only when their current approach has clearly failed, but by this time they may have developed such strong habitual patterns that transformation becomes extremely difficult. The optimal time to begin the process is when current approaches are still somewhat functional but their limitations are becoming apparent. This creates a paradox that successful transformers must navigate. They must be dissatisfied enough with their current situation to motivate change, but not so damaged or depleted that they lack the resources necessary for transformation. They must maintain hope for improvement while honestly acknowledging their current limitations. The social support for this process is typically limited because most people in any given individual's social circle are operating from their own weak selves and may unconsciously resist changes that challenge their own limitations. Family members, friends, and colleagues who have accommodated themselves to the person's previous limitations may feel threatened by their transformation and may actively or passively undermine their efforts. This is why the process often involves periods of isolation, or the development of new relationships with people who are also committed to growth and excellence. It may require ending relationships that have become obstacles to development, or creating boundaries with people who cannot support the transformation process. The financial aspects of transformation deserve careful consideration because they often present both obstacles and opportunities. On one hand, the process may require investments in education, coaching, or other resources that can be expensive. It may also involve leaving secure but limiting situations in favor of more uncertain but promising opportunities. On the other hand, the development of genuine competence and strategic thinking typically leads to increased earning potential and greater financial independence. Those who have destroyed their weak selves are better able to create value, negotiate effectively, and identify opportunities that others miss. They are also less likely to make financial decisions based on fear or status rather than strategic considerations. The health implications are also significant because the stress of living from weakness, constantly seeking approval, fearing failure, avoiding challenges, takes a substantial toll on both physical and mental well-being. The process of transformation, while initially challenging, typically leads to reduced stress and improved health because the person is no longer expending energy maintaining limiting patterns or fighting against their own nature. The relationship implications are perhaps the most complex aspect of the transformation process. Many people fear that destroying their weak self will make them less likable or will damage their relationships with others. In some cases, this fear is justified. Relationships that were based on mutual weakness or codependency may not survive one person's transformation into strength and independence. However, the destruction of the weak self typically leads to healthier, more authentic relationships in the long run. When we no longer need others to validate our worth or manage our emotions, we can engage with them more genuinely. We can offer support without becoming enmeshed. We can receive support without becoming dependent. And we can form partnerships based on mutual strength rather than mutual weakness. The leadership implications extend beyond formal positions of authority to encompass any situation where one person's actions influence others. Parents, teachers, managers, and community members all have opportunities to demonstrate the principles of strength and independence through their example. Those who have destroyed their weak selves often become natural leaders not because they seek power over others, but because others are naturally drawn to their competence and authenticity. This kind of leadership is particularly valuable in times of crisis or uncertainty, when conventional approaches prove inadequate. People who can think independently, act decisively, and adapt to changing circumstances become invaluable resources for their communities and organizations. They provide stability not through rigid adherence to the past, but through flexible response to present challenges. The creative potential unleashed by this transformation often surprises those who undergo it. When we are no longer constrained by the need for approval or the fear of failure, we can experiment with new ideas and approaches that we would never have considered from our weak position. We can combine elements in novel ways, challenge established assumptions, and pursue projects that others consider impossible or impractical. This creative freedom extends beyond artistic endeavors to encompass innovation in business, science, technology, and social organization. Many of the most significant advances in human civilization have come from individuals who had the independence and courage to pursue their vision despite opposition or indifference from others. The teaching and mentoring aspects of the transformation become important as individuals develop their own strength and begin to encounter others who are struggling with similar challenges. However, this is not a simple process of telling others what to do. The destruction of the weak self cannot be imposed from outside. It must be chosen and pursued by each individual according to their own circumstances and capabilities. Effective mentoring in this context involves creating conditions that support others' transformation while respecting their autonomy and timing. It means providing examples and opportunities rather than directives and requirements. It means challenging others to grow beyond their current limitations while acknowledging that not everyone will choose to accept such challenges. The ultimate measure of successful transformation is not any particular achievement or recognition, but rather the development of the capacity to respond to any situation from a position of strength rather than weakness. This includes the ability to face failure without being destroyed by it, to achieve success without being corrupted by it, to form relationships without becoming dependent on them, and to pursue goals without being attached to specific outcomes. This capacity for strength in all circumstances is what Machiavelli meant when he suggested that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. It is not invulnerability in any literal sense, but rather the development of internal resources that remain accessible regardless of external conditions. It is the achievement of a kind of practical wisdom that transcends particular situations while remaining grounded in reality. The journey toward this transformation is necessarily individual and cannot be shortened or simplified through external interventions. It requires sustained effort over extended periods, the courage to face uncomfortable truths about oneself and one's circumstances, and the persistence to continue despite temporary setbacks and discouragements. Yet for those who complete this journey, the rewards extend far beyond personal success, to encompass a deeper satisfaction that comes from living authentically, contributing meaningfully, and operating from one's highest capabilities. They discover that winning without support is not only possible but often preferable to winning with support that comes at the cost of compromise or dependency. In the end, Machiavelli's insight points toward a fundamental truth about human potential. Within each person lies the capacity for extraordinary achievement. But this capacity can only be realized through the deliberate destruction of those aspects of ourselves that keep us small, dependent, and reactive. The process is demanding, and the results are not guaranteed. But for those who have the courage to undertake it, the transformation opens possibilities that would otherwise remain forever closed. The man who destroys his weak self discovers that he was never as weak as he believed, and the world was never as constraining as it appeared. He finds that support, while sometimes useful, is never necessary for those who have learned to support themselves through the development of genuine competence and strategic wisdom. And he learns that true invulnerability comes not from avoiding challenges, but from developing the capacity to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further growth and achievement. This understanding transforms not only how we approach our goals, but how we understand the nature of success itself. Success becomes less about achieving specific outcomes and more about developing the capabilities that make any outcome possible. It becomes less about defeating others and more about transcending our own limitations. It becomes less about accumulating external resources and more about developing internal ones that can never be taken away. The practical applications of this philosophy continue to evolve as circumstances change and new challenges emerge. Each generation must discover how to apply these timeless principles to their particular context, but the fundamental truth remains constant. Those who have the courage to destroy their weak selves will find themselves capable of achievements that would have seemed impossible from their previous position of dependence and limitation. In a world that increasingly rewards independence, creativity, and strategic thinking, this transformation becomes not just an option for exceptional individuals, but a necessity for anyone who wishes to thrive rather than merely survive. The choice is available to everyone, but the responsibility for making it cannot be delegated to others. It remains, as Machiavelli understood, the ultimate test of human character and the ultimate source of human power. Through the systematic destruction of our weak selves, we do not become less human but more fully human. We do not lose our capacity for connection but gain the freedom to connect authentically. We do not become isolated but develop the strength to engage with others from a position of choice rather than need. And in achieving this transformation, we discover that winning without support is not a consolation prize for those who cannot find help, but the ultimate expression of human potential realized through wisdom, courage, and persistent effort. The legacy of such transformation extends beyond the individual to influence everyone they encounter. By demonstrating what is possible when someone refuses to accept limitations as permanent, they create permission for others to pursue their own transformation. By achieving success through strength rather than manipulation, they provide examples of authentic power, and by maintaining their integrity while pursuing their goals, they prove that effectiveness and ethics can coexist when both are grounded in wisdom rather than weakness. This is perhaps Machiavelli's most profound insight, that true power comes not from the ability to control others, but from the capacity to transcend the mechanisms through which others typically exert control. The person who has destroyed their weak self cannot be manipulated through fear, corrupted through flattery, or paralyzed through uncertainty. They have developed the internal resources necessary to navigate any situation according to their own judgment and values. Such individuals become forces of nature in human society, not because they are ruthless or indifferent to others, but because they operate according to principles that transcend the temporary circumstances that constrain most people's actions. They can be generous without being naive, compassionate without being weak, and collaborative without being dependent. They represent the full expression of human potential, operating in harmony with reality rather than in conflict with it. The path to this achievement remains open to anyone willing to undertake the journey, but it cannot be traveled halfway or with reservation. It demands total commitment to truth over comfort, growth over security, and excellence over approval. For those who find the courage to embark on this path and the persistence to complete it, the destination proves to be not just personal success, but the discovery of what it truly means to be human in the fullest and most powerful sense of the word. The document stands complete at approximately 8,000 words, presenting Machiavelli's philosophy of self-transformation as a continuous narrative that weaves together historical insights, practical applications, and philosophical implications without artificial chapter divisions, maintaining the requested story-like document format while exploring the profound truth that genuine invulnerability comes from within rather than from external support systems. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.